Hello everyone, this is my video on Franz Fanon's The Wretches of the Earth. This is my first impressions of this book. Now, this is not an in-depth video on it because this is my first reading through the book, The Wretches of the Earth. And in all honesty, I'm just giving you my honest thoughts about this book and why I feel like it's the most important, at least one of the most important books that I think anybody should be reading, honestly. If you're a so called Marxist and you claim, you know, you want to fight for a better world, then you got to understand one of the most key components of that is to understand the history of racism, colonialism, and how important that is to liberating the global proletariat. Because if you're not for the liberation of the African people in Africa or the new African people in America, then all your words and all your rhetoric about freeing the proletariat from the chains of the bourgeoisie is just nothing more than hollow words. The Wretches of the Earth, I believe everybody should be reading this if you're a Marxist. Because there's a lot of dialectical information in this book regarding the history of colonialism, how it affects the psyche, how racism, how it causes mental disorders. And this book, more than any book that I've read on the subject, has gotten into the detail on the effects of racism and colonialism, the violence that it causes to its victims. Now, this book is not entry-level material like Settlers is. In my opinion, this is a book that is essential. Especially if you're a third worldist, I think you should read this book. Hell, if you're a Marxist-Leninist, you should read this book. Because regardless what you want to hear somebody say about, oh, you shouldn't be reading this book because blah, 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 blah. That's just reactionary fucking racist horseshit. Why, were the Black Panthers, the originals, why were they the way they were? What influenced them? And to understand Black Panther history, and you're studying the Black Panthers, you have to read this book. Because this, along with Malcolm X's autobiography, are one of the most essential components to understand anti-racism. None of this garbage like white fragility that basically doesn't actually get to the root of the problem, but an actual dialectical book on anti-colonialism. And I am sorry if you call yourself a Marxist and you refuse to read this book, then I don't take you seriously as a Marxist. Because how are you going to fight for the liberation of the global proletariat when you're not going to understand the effects of colonialism has on most of the world's population? Most of the world's population lives in Africa. Not America, not Europe, Africa. And that's also the origin of all of humanity as well. More than anything, this book gives more context to the current state of the world. Yes, it was published half a century ago, but this book couldn't be more relevant today as it was when it was first published. Frantz Fanon understood his work. He understood what the effects of colonialism has on a population. Generations of racial oppression. And I'm sorry, nobody can convince me otherwise. You cannot separate race with class. They're one and the same. Anybody that says it isn't is obviously white. and doesn't understand the effects of colonialism, what it has on the psyche of those who suffer the boot of colonialism. Frantz Fanon's book is not something that you're going to understand completely the first time you read it. In fact, there's more stuff I'm going to have to read about and revisit this book again. Unlike J. Sakai's Settlers, which there's a lot of information in that book that I didn't know that I simply have to investigate further. Frantz Fanon's book, it's better to read other stuff before you read Frantz Fanon's book. And another book that's a companion piece that's recommended by, I don't remember the person's name, I'll give a link to their channel, that Paul Morin interviewed, that actually gives further context to the content that Frantz Fanon talks about in this book. Now, as someone that's read this book on his own, I recommend anybody that wants to read this book or would like to, don't do what I did. Read it with a group. Read it with a study group if you can. Because the material in this book that's discussed is very complex. And I don't think you're going to be able to understand it the first time going through it unless you are with other people that you could discuss the same thing with them. Because not everyone who reads this book is going to interpret the book the same way. I think Frantz Fanon's The Wretches of the Earth is one of the most essential books in Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, Third Worldism. But even if you are a Marxist-Leninist, I still think you should read this book because the Black Panthers, regardless what you supposed Marxists who claim to know Marxism want to say, the Black Panthers were Marxist-Leninists. So by disregarding this book, you are disregarding a piece of Marxist-Leninist history. This is one of the most essential books if you want to have the full context of colonialism, especially in the United States. For me, it's one of the most important texts in general for Marxism. Anybody that disagrees with me, prove me wrong. Prove me wrong. Who came the closest to have a revolution in the United States? It wasn't the CPUSA, it was the Black Panthers. And the Black Panthers were crushed in their infancy. They actually came a lot further than most. So, you want to understand the Black Panther Party, the originals? You got to read this book. Because Huey P. Newton brings this book up quite a bit in a lot of his writings and speeches. Anyway, I am done talking about this book for now. Hopefully the discussion of this book isn't as childish as Settlers was. So, have a good day. And stay safe, everyone.